I never thought I'd be the kind of person to ask for judgment from strangers, but here I am. My question is simple. Am I the asshole for hating my father? At face value, it sounds harsh, maybe even unwarranted, but I want to tell my story before you decide. Growing up, my father lived with us. You'd think that would mean he was present in my life, but he wasn't. He existed in the same space, but he never really showed up. My mother carried everything, emotionally, financially, and practically. Every responsibility, every struggle she faced alone while he, indifferent and detached, coasted by without lifting a finger. As a kid, I didn't understand why things were the way they were. I just knew that my mom was always exhausted, and my dad seemed content in his bubble of apathy. He wasn't cruel or abusive, at least not in the conventional sense, but his neglect was its own form of violence. It was a steady erosion of what a family is supposed to feel like. Looking back, I wonder how much that environment shaped me. I'm a quiet, introspective person with few friends. I have trouble trusting people, letting them in. Did I inherit that emotional distance from him? Or was it a defense mechanism growing up in a household where warmth was so rare? Still, I didn't hate him then. Disappointment, frustration, even embarrassment. Yes, but not hate. That came later, much later, when his choices stopped being passively neglectful and became something darker. That's the story I need to tell you. But before I go on, I need you to understand where it all started. In a home where one parent gave everything and the other gave nothing. As I grew older, my father began to change, or at least, I began to see him differently. His apathy, which I once mistook for neutrality, started to reveal a sharper edge. He wasn't just disconnected, he was stubborn, confrontational, and at times, outright hostile. The man I thought I knew became someone entirely different in my eyes. A figure who carried his outdated, almost Neanderthal mindset like a badge of honor. His temper surfaced more often. Arguments that could have been resolved with simple conversations escalated into shouting matches. He seemed incapable of understanding other people or respecting their boundaries. Socially, he was a disaster, awkward and abrasive, someone who alienated everyone around him. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was a product of his time, a man raised in an environment that didn't value emotional intelligence or vulnerability. Maybe he never had the chance to learn what it meant to be empathetic, to be kind. I painted him as someone deeply ignorant, a man stumbling through relationships he didn't know how to navigate. But over time, that narrative didn't hold up. His actions went beyond ignorance. They felt intentional, even cruel. He didn't just lack social skills, he lacked basic decency. He crossed lines with a casualness that was both shocking and infuriating. It wasn't that he didn't know better, it was that he didn't care. I found myself constantly at odds with him. Every conversation was a battle, every request an opportunity for him to push back. His resistance felt less like misunderstanding and more like a deliberate act of defiance. The man who once ignored me now seemed to go out of his way to provoke me. It was around this time that my perception of him began to solidify. He wasn't just a flawed man who had made mistakes. He was someone who chose to act in ways that hurt others, someone whose selfishness left scars on everyone around him. And for me, those scars were just beginning to form. As I tried to make sense of my father's behavior, I started looking more closely at who he really was. Maybe it was an act of self-preservation, trying to justify his actions in a way that didn't make me spiral into anger. I told myself he was just a man who had never been taught how to be better, a victim of his own upbringing. No father to guide him, no role model to emulate. It made sense in theory. But the more I observed him, the more this narrative fell apart. His behavior wasn't simply the result of ignorance, it was the product of deliberate choices. I saw the way he manipulated situations to suit his needs, the way he dismissed people's feelings as though they were obstacles in his path. He wasn't just careless, he was calculated. It became impossible to ignore. I watched him take actions that went beyond selfishness. He lied when the truth was inconvenient, broke promises with alarming ease, and treated decency like it was optional. He acted as if rules, even the unwritten ones that govern kindness and respect, didn't apply to him. The hardest part was recognizing how deeply this affected my perception of myself. Was I just a mirror of him? Did his indifference, his casual cruelty, bleed into who I was becoming? I wanted to believe I was different, but I couldn't shake the fear that some part of me was shaped by his flaws. When I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt, I felt a strange mix of clarity and despair. There was no redemption arc here, no tragic backstory that could soften the truth. He wasn't a misunderstood man. He was someone who chose time and time again to be the person he was. And the closer I looked, the harder it became to look away. Growing up in that house left marks on me that I didn't fully understand until much later. I didn't have the typical childhood filled with laughter, friends, and a sense of security. Instead, I withdrew into myself, creating a world where I felt safe, but also utterly alone. I've always been introspective, the kind of person who overthinks every conversation, every interaction. It's not that I didn't want to connect with others, I just didn't know how. Trust felt like a risk I couldn't afford to take. Friends came and went, but real connections? Those were rare. Most of the time I felt like I was on the outside looking in, a spectator in my own life. And then there was my dog. He wasn't just a pet, he was my anchor. For years, he was the one constant, the one being I could count on. When I came home feeling the weight of the world, or more often, the weight of my father's words, he was there, wagging his tail, reminding me that I wasn't invisible. He didn't care about my flaws, my insecurities, or the parts of me I tried to hide. He just loved me unconditionally. In him, I found a source of warmth I didn't know I was missing. He gave me something I couldn't get anywhere else, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just my dog. He was my family in a way I had never experienced before. My father, of course, didn't see it that way. To him, the dog was just an animal, a nuisance that got in the way. And that difference in perspective, how much I loved this dog and how little he cared, would soon lead to a breaking point I'll never forget. The tension between my father and me had been building for years, but nothing prepared me for what happened that day. It wasn't sudden. It was the result of countless warnings, conversations, and arguments that my father ignored, as if my concerns were trivial. I had made it clear, repeatedly, that using poison in the backyard was dangerous. Not just for the pests he was trying to get rid of, but for my dog, the one being that gave my life meaning. I offered alternatives, humane traps, non-toxic solutions, anything that wouldn't put my dog at risk. But my father dismissed them with a wave of his hand, like he always did. I remember that morning vividly. I'd stayed up late the night before, so I was still asleep when he decided to act. He scattered poison in the yard without a word, despite knowing the risk. By the time I woke up, it was too late. My dog, curious and trusting as always, had gotten into it. The hours that followed were a blur of panic and heartbreak. I rushed him to the vet, hoping against hope that something could be done. But the damage was irreversible. I held him as he slipped away, his eyes filled with confusion and pain, and I felt something inside me break. I can't describe the rage and despair I felt in that moment. It wasn't just grief for my dog. It was the weight of every argument, every dismissal, every time my father had chosen his own convenience over someone else's well-being. He hadn't just poisoned my dog, he'd poisoned the fragile bond we still had. When I confronted him, he brushed it off as an accident, as if he couldn't comprehend the gravity of what he'd done. But I knew better. I had warned him, pleaded with him, and he had chosen to ignore me. Whether it was malice or apathy didn't matter anymore. The result was the same. I had lost the one being who made life bearable, and for that I couldn't forgive him. My dog wasn't just a pet, he was my everything. He filled the voids in my life that no one else seemed to notice, let alone care about. In a world where I often felt unseen and unheard, he gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed each morning. His joy was infectious, his loyalty unwavering, and his presence a comfort I never thought I deserved. We had our routines, simple but meaningful. Morning walks where the world felt quiet and manageable. Evenings spent curled up together on the couch. He was always there, whether I needed to vent my frustrations or just sit in silence. He didn't ask for much, just my attention and care, which I gave willingly. In return, he gave me the kind of love that didn't come with conditions or complications. He was more than a companion. He represented everything I wanted in life but couldn't find: trust, consistency, and a connection free of judgment. It wasn't just that he was a good dog, it was that he brought out the best in me. Around him, I felt like a better version of myself, someone capable of love and kindness, even when the rest of the world seemed bleak. His loss didn't just take him away, it took a part of me with it. The part that believed in good things, in small joys that could outweigh the pain. Without him, the house felt colder, emptier, and infinitely lonelier. I couldn't understand how my father didn't see what he meant to me, how he dismissed my bond with the dog as trivial. To him, it was just an animal. To me, it was everything. And that difference in perspective made his actions feel even more deliberate, even more unforgivable. The days after my dog's death felt like a blur, but the emotions were sharp and unrelenting. Guilt and grief consumed me, tangled together so tightly I couldn't separate them. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Maybe I should have been more forceful in my warnings. Maybe I should have woken up earlier that morning. Maybe somehow I could have saved him. I knew rationally that I wasn't to blame. My father had made the decision to use poison despite my countless objections. But knowing that didn't ease the weight I carried. It didn't stop the haunting thought that, as much as I loved my dog, I had failed him in the end. The grief was overwhelming. Losing him wasn't just about losing a pet. It was about losing a connection that I desperately needed. The house felt suffocating without his presence. No wagging tail to greet me at the door. No warm body curled up at my feet. His absence was a constant reminder of how fragile the good things in my life seemed to be. And then there was the anger. It burned underneath the sadness, a steady flame that refused to die out. My father's dismissive attitude toward the entire situation only fueled it. He didn't see the gravity of what he'd done, or worse, he didn't care. His indifference felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that my feelings, my grief, and even my dog's life were insignificant to him. The combination of guilt, grief, and anger left me adrift. I didn't know how to process it all. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't find a way to escape the pain. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my feelings toward my father had shifted completely. This wasn't just disappointment or frustration anymore. It was hatred, raw and undeniable. And that hatred was starting to consume me. In the days that followed, I found myself spiraling, desperate for anything that could numb the ache. The grief was unbearable. The silence in the house a constant reminder of what I'd lost. I couldn't stay there, surrounded by the memories and the tension with my father. So I started leaving. I began going to places I'd never been before. Bars, parties, anywhere that promised distraction. It was out of character for me. I've always been introverted, someone who preferred solitude over socializing, but solitude had become unbearable, so I sought out noise, hoping it would drown out the thoughts that refused to leave me alone. At first, it worked. For a few hours I could lose myself in the haze of music and chatter, in the dulling effects of alcohol. But the relief was fleeting. As soon as I was alone again, the weight came crashing back, heavier than before. The nights blurred together, a cycle of escape and regret that left me feeling hollow. I hated what I was becoming. I'd never been someone who relied on external crutches to cope, but now I feared I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. I wasn't just grieving my dog, I was grieving the part of me that felt hopeful, the part that believed things could get better. Even in the chaos of those nights out, I couldn't stop thinking about my father. His role in all of this, his indifference to my pain, haunted me. It was like I was running from him as much as I was running from myself. But no matter how far I tried to escape, the anger and sadness followed, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The more I tried to escape, the more I found myself circling back to the same question. How did it come to this? How did my relationship with my father become so broken, so filled with resentment? I couldn't stop dissecting every moment, every argument, every dismissal, as though finding an answer might bring me some kind of peace. I thought about the years I spent trying to understand him, trying to bridge the gap between us. I had convinced myself that he wasn't cruel, just incapable, someone who didn't know how to love because he'd never been shown love himself. But after everything that happened, that justification felt hollow. His choices, his actions, spoke louder than any excuses I could make for him. Even now I struggled with the weight of my feelings. Hate isn't an emotion that comes easily. It takes energy. It consumes you. But how else was I supposed to feel? He didn't just neglect to care, he actively went against me at every turn. He ignored my warnings, dismissed my concerns, and in doing so, he destroyed something irreplaceable. And yet I couldn't decide what hurt more, his actions or his complete lack of remorse. When I confronted him, hoping for some sign of guilt or regret, there was nothing. No apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he caused, just a casual indifference that cut deeper than words ever could. I wanted to forgive him, or at least let go of the anger, but it felt impossible. How do you forgive someone who doesn't think they've done anything wrong? How do you move on when the person responsible refuses to meet you halfway? These questions circled endlessly in my mind, leaving me stuck, unable to move forward, and unsure if I even wanted to. And now, here I am, left with a question I can't answer on my own. Am I the asshole for hating my father? It's a question that keeps me up at night, one that I can't seem to shake no matter how hard I try. I look back on everything, the years of neglect, the indifference, the selfishness, and finally the loss of my dog. I see a man who refused to listen, who dismissed my concerns as if they were meaningless. I see a father who never truly tried to be one, and a man who cared more about his own convenience than the well-being of those around him. But I also see myself. I see the anger that has taken root inside me, growing stronger with every memory, every confrontation. I see the ways it has started to affect me, how it clouds my thoughts, how it isolates me even further. Hating him feels justified, but it also feels heavy, like a burden I'm not sure I want to carry anymore. There are people who've told me I'm overreacting, that it was just a dog, that my father didn't mean to hurt me. They say it was an accident, that I should let it go. But how do you let go of something that feels so deeply personal? How do you forgive someone who doesn't acknowledge the harm they've done? I don't know if I'll ever find those answers. All I know is that right now, the pain and the anger feel insurmountable. I miss my dog every day. I miss the warmth, the companionship, the love that he brought into my life. And every time I think about him, I think about what my father took from me. So I'll leave it up to you. You've heard my story, seen it through my eyes. Tell me, am I the asshole for hating my father? Or is this anger, this grief, this overwhelming sense of betrayal justified? I don't know anymore, and maybe, just maybe, you can help me figure it out.